Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for taking the time and joining us today. I'm Vicki Carr, broker with the Hardman Group here on the East Coast of Canada. Welcome to the 11th edition of Consumer Real Estate Canada CREC Talk Shop. The Zoom will last approximately 30 minutes today, and as always is being recorded to be made available afterwards on our website at www.crec.live. The live chat will be monitored throughout the Zoom call. For any questions and comments that come up from anyone attending live, there will also be a Q&A at the end of our 30 minutes together. We have sponsorship opportunities that will only increase your brand awareness, attract new clients. CREC will enhance your business from coast to coast. Reach out to us at crec.live to learn how we can highlight your business. I will now turn it over to our 2023 CREC Chair, Slava Fedossenko with Avenue Living in Edmonton.
Thank you, Vicki. Appreciate the introduction. Today, I'm very happy to welcome a good friend of CREC, Kieron Hunt with FBM Planning and Architecture. Kieron, I would love to hear directly from you firsthand, a bit of an introduction and your background.
Absolutely, it's a pleasure to be here. Thanks everyone for taking the time out of your days to your mornings out west and your afternoons to sit and chat with me. Yeah, I am coming to you live from Halifax. Looks like we have some good East Coast presence on this call, so that's always nice. I am the planning studio lead and at FBM Architecture, and we also have a subsidiary, FBM Planning Limited, of which I'm the director of. And over the past 22 years, I have developed a repertoire as a planner, but specializing in retail market analyses, industrial land use planning. So I kind of have a different toolkit than most planners with respect to market analyses. I started out west. I'm relatively new to the East Coast. I moved from Vancouver here in 2019 with a background from SFU in urban studies, urban geography, and a master's in urban studies. And starting out in the Vancouver market with a firm that had deep roots, Thomas Consultants, for those who may know, that might date my age as well. But learning under the likes of Ian Thomas and others, there seems to be a long pool of talent that's come from that path. And then moving my ways through various firms, working with architecture and engineering firms, including one I'm now, particularly because there's a crossover between the market analysis world and what architects like to draw. I always say it's all, architects, I free up architects so that they can draw. So we work with a lot of developers, municipalities, other organizations in defining, sort of assessing, identifying, defining retail opportunities. So within that skill set, probably going back to 2010, I started doing after doing a lot of international work, including Dubai and Middle East and Russia, Moscow, you name it, and I probably touched on some of those continents. I started to rein in my focus on the Canadian market for retail, what we call retail market analysis or retail gap analyses specifically, and have really built a portfolio working across the country from coast to coast with municipalities and in particular the economic development entities, and in some respects planning, because they do cross over, to develop these retail gap analyses for communities ranging in size from anything less than a couple thousand people to larger cities like Edmonton or Saskatoon or Regina across Canada. So within that world there, these retail gap analyses really cross over and identify what's missing in communities, where a community is in its growth spectrum, what opportunities they can have to pursue for retail opportunities. And that's led me to working with the likes of Michael and Slava, as you would know from working with Tascowin, sort of the way these studies can be positioned for communities to attract retail businesses, both entrepreneurial, branded, or otherwise. So again, I've really grown that business over the last, since 2010, I've probably done about 45 of these studies across Canada for various municipalities. The most proactive of which I will say are Albertans. And then you have Saskatchewan and Ontario following behind, and in Atlantic Canada now, where they didn't typically do those things because population wasn't really a factor of growth. Now with communities like Moncton and Fredericton and St. John and Halifax, all exhibiting strong growth dynamics, they're starting to realize the opportunities to attract retail business, but need that platform of information to really be able to do it proactively.
Awesome, Kieron. That was a great intro. And just so that everybody on the call is aware, would you like to pull up a recent gap analysis? I also have one on my end here for Wetaskiwin that we can go through briefly and just show the audience, give them a brief idea of what it is you're referring to and just how detailed these reports can be.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have anyone I can pull up on my screen right now, but again, if you have the Wetaskiwin one, that would be great. I think. And while you're doing that, I'll say that what's interesting about these studies is that with cities like Fort Saskatchewan or Spruce Grove, I've done Spruce Grove. I started the first one in 2010, and I've done almost five updates. So every couple of years, the communities use these as templates and update them, so their data is always fresh. Again, this is where Alberta always seems to shine, and it's sort of wanting to be upfront and current with their data. So Fort Saskatchewan, I've done those 4 times. Grand Prairie, City of Grand Prairie, done 4 of these updates as well, going back to 2014. So there's really a lot of value in the initial one, but also updating these, and the success from some of these communities works and is proof in sort of which tenants they're able to bring into the community on the backs of these sorts of studies. But yeah, this one with Wetaskiwin we did just coming out of the pandemic.
January 21.
Yeah, so it was an interesting time to be doing these studies for sure, because we were also looking at the impact of what COVID did for some of the businesses, and trying to give a little bit of an outlook as to where local businesses could go. But in the case of Wetaskiwin, not being a large market, but being sort of a secondary smaller market, but it's having its own service region. We typically look at these projects from multiple layers. We look at what sort of guiding policies are in place that can dictate retail opportunities. So almost a traditional planning approach, if you will, where growth is planned, how much is planned, and we'll usually try to validate that. In this case, we looked at some of the COVID-19 trends pre and post, looking at Stats Canada data, but we also do a lot of looking at what is happening in the development world for the types of trends, and we always try to sensitize that to the size and type of the community in which we're working. The trade area is always an interesting one, and one of the key things I always say to a lot of clients, especially municipalities, when you're dealing with economic development, a lot of municipalities will come to you and say, we have let's just say an example of a 50,000 person trade area, and that's the figure they've been using, and they haven't been getting any retailers to bite. And the reality is that that's an anecdotal. They don't have any sense to understand why they've chosen that trade area. So a lot of what we do can either validate the anecdotal or rein them in a bit and be realistic about who they can pursue. So I think that's often the case with some communities where we might have a mayor saying, we should have a Costco, and I'll say, well, you're not going to get a Costco. And that has happened. And sometimes the mayors are, they're boosters for their communities, but they're not based and grounded in any empirical reality. So we will try to like I said, assess and validate this anecdotal and come up with something that really works. And to do that, we can use in-person surveys, telephone surveys, online surveys to test the wider market and find out how they spend their money, where they come from, where they do most of their shopping. And obviously over the last 5 years, we've started to track how much people are spending online, because that also has an impact on the dollars spent in the community in the bricks and mortar world. So with Wetaskiwin, we did test their trade area, because they run into some discussions where they think they might be drawing out towards Leduc, and it's not a reality for them when Leduc's retail is growing. So we developed a trade area that was reasonable and realistic, as we use in the planning world a lot, for them to secure most of their customer business. and that's probably 80% within that primary trade area. And what we do in detail with those communities is we look at we don't just look and say there's this little shopping center here and a node here. We will go into great detail in these gap analyses to document every retail, particularly street front retail business that exists. We'll document them by merchandise categories that we then correlate to spending. And that's spending or sales, I should say. So we estimate the retail sales throughout the community based on where the retail is, who their co-tenancies are, what type of foot traffic they generate. We'll sensitize that and measure it against the trade area spending to understand how much they're capturing. And through that process, we start to get the gaps and see where there might be a large outflow that could be captured by certain retailers, or if there's surplus inflow, which again suggests there's a strong segment of opportunity. So that's the process we use. And in Wetaskiwin, we looked at that, and a lot of communities that might be smaller, we try to bring that layer of realism in to say there's certain low-hanging fruit that you could pursue, as opposed to more larger regional serving markets or destination types of markets. And Wetaskiwin is a good example of sort of a smaller second-tier community that's had some success. I think, Slava, you've been able to use this to leverage for some tenants, and I think the realism that comes with it, I think, also buys credibility for the community.
And Kieron, as you mentioned, I do have to thank you personally for your retail gap analysis of the city of Wetaskiwin. We have, in fact, used it to varying degrees of success, and just in a more general sense, having these gap analyses is not only so valuable for the municipalities that hire you, that obviously have these blind spots that need your advice, but also for the developers within the market that can really lean on data and something a little more empirical when they're targeting some of these retailers that, there's a good chance that a lot of major retailers have never heard of one of these markets that you might do a gap analysis for example, Wetaskiwin. And these analyses just lend so much credibility to the developers and the communities as well. And like you said, it's an iterative process where, the report may have come out 2.5 years ago, nearly 3 years ago, and there have been a lot of changes since then. So it's great to keep updating these reports for the more proactive municipalities, and it's a virtuous circle.
Yeah, I think the benefit for the communities, I mean, the economic development work for the communities as a whole. And one thing that we do with a lot of the communities is we don't stop when we give them the report at the end. And Michael would know this, is that part of our role, or the role that I see us as having, is to help the community, one, present the documented findings. Sometimes it's useful because they're not savvy communities necessarily, and we can present them these reports. But we also work with them to try and identify what types of brands or tenants they should be pursuing. And in some respects, this might not just be the bigger national corporate brands, but identifying local franchisees against which those local communities have a pool of locals that may have expressed interest, but they don't know what's available to them. And then also at a lower level, particularly for even smaller, more rural communities, what we find is that the documents can be used to help local entrepreneurs with their business plans. And through that process, what they typically do is that anyone looking to open or start a business, they may have a home business, but what they can use is the data in there as part of their business plan to say, look, there's this amount of spending on these categories. This is what I want to try and open in our community. So it does help to stimulate and spur some of that entrepreneurial activity in the smaller rural companies where brands aren't drawn and aren't likely to come for a while. And then, the bigger play for us with some of the medium and larger municipalities, take Wetaskiwin or Fort Saskatchewan, Spruce Grove, even Cape Breton in communities in Cape Breton here in Sydney and on Cape Breton Island, would be working with helping them navigate the world of ICSC and their deal-making conferences, because that can be overwhelming for a lot of communities. So we'll help to identify who they could reach out to through those networks and contacts of brokers, developers, retailers, and work with them to try and say, here's a community, and they've got multiple opportunities. It may not be one specific one. In some cases, it might be they're working with a developer on a specific opportunity, but in many respects, they're marketing their broader community. So they might come armed with a few potential locations for a retailer, but we'll help navigate the complexities of ICSC so that they can have those meetings and try to build the relationships, because oftentimes it may not happen where you go 1 year and you get your deal right away. You have to build that trust with some of the brokers and developers and retailers, and that trust comes through a bit of repetition, going one year, or a second year, or a third year, and then they say, oh yeah, you're familiar. I believe what you're saying now. I've done some research on my own, and you know what? Let's talk about this opportunity. And that's where the value really comes in. So to my point originally was that we don't sort of leave a community or a client necessarily hanging and taking a 40, 50, 70-page report and saying, here, you deal with it. We'll try to help them through the process in whatever way we can.
Yeah, like you said, Kieron, it's a very iterative process, and it does take years to get in front of these retailers on occasion, and municipalities do have to do a good job of following up and also having good relationships with developers in their communities. Who would you say typically reaches out to you to begin one of these retail gap analyses?
I would say for the terminology of a retail gap analysis, it's usually municipalities through the economic development wing of a municipality. Those are most frequent. The subtlety of a retail market analysis can be a little different, because that's usually private sector developers that will come and say, maybe the municipality has required them to do a retail market analysis. The approach is similar, but a little different, because you're dealing with one specific site or project as opposed to a broader community. But the overall principle is still somewhat the same. But the majority of our work, at least over the last decade, has come from the proactive municipalities, those ones that just inherently feel there's an opportunity, but they can't get any traction because the retailers or developers say, no, we need information. So the information is where we come into play, and then the what does it mean as well is as important as the data itself. So some communities might just say, well, here's our StatsCan data. Well, by year 4, you're out of date on StatsCan, and if there's no analysis behind what it means for spending for retailers for the target markets you're looking for, it becomes irrelevant. So most of our clients come from the municipal sector, and interestingly, even the ones that, as I was speaking about how proactive it is out west, especially again in the western provinces, what I have found is since my time moving out here in the east and sort of talking to folks, some of those people that have gone out west have realized and come across maybe a study from myself or others, and have said, okay, well, that's what we need for this community. Where has this been? And that's slowly happening out east. We've made inroads into Ontario as well. Over the past year, we've done about 4 or 5 projects in the last 2 years in Ontario, and then out in Nova Scotia again. We're starting to do a lot of smaller communities as well, because of the new growth dynamics that Atlantic Canada is facing. And ironically, one of the clients in Cape Breton came from the West. So he's very familiar with these sorts of studies. It's Tyler Mathis, who was in the District of Hope, who's very familiar with how all of these processes work. So he brings that to an organization and says, this is how we can approach this. And as I like to say to some of the clients, you have to get used to hearing no's a lot from retailers and developers and brokers. You just have to be comfortable that not every retailer is going to say yes, but you can get a decent enough conversion to get a few that make a difference in your community. And retailers have that herd mentality. Sometimes they like to sort of say, oh, they've chosen that market. Why are they there? I didn't know about that. The next thing you know, they're trying to find the opportunity that may not have a restrictive covenant attached to it.
Yeah, you answered about three of my questions in a row. So I just wanted to say that you're obviously becoming a bit of a celebrity in the Canadian retail scene. If word is getting out about these gap analyses and you're being contacted by all kinds of new municipalities, that's great news, and speaks to your a level of detail and professionalism in these reports.
Appreciate that. Yeah, it takes time. It's all relationship building. It's how it's all established. Ian Thomas was the master of that originally, and he'd like to take things from people that taught you along the way.
Absolutely. And so that's a good segue into the last portion of our chat, which is let's talk about targeted leasing and specifically the basics of a tenant mix. Let's take a step back, and when you are beginning to recommend to municipalities, these are your retail gaps, this is what you should be focusing on. Where would we start, for example? What are some of the key services, key retailers that you really look for first in some of these markets, whether that's a small town or whether that's even individual developments?
Yeah, the way I break communities, or we look at communities, is there's various scales of support for retailers along the spectrum of communities. You might have, you have those small rural towns, and you go all the way up to urban cities and regional destinations. So there's really a bit of the mix varies as you progress through a community's size spectrum, and there is a direct, usually quite a direct correlation between the thresholds at which a retailer will select a community, for example, or even a neighborhood or a concentration. Shoppers Drug Mart might want, for an 18,000 square foot store, might want 10,000 people minimum. So we have to have an understanding when we go into the community of, one, the community size itself, but then the trade area, again, coming into the fact of where the reality of a trade area is. And we'll say if it's a smaller town, we'll look at what size it's typically going to be, your basic services, your basic amenities for grocery, again, smaller scale grocery, and local operators. Then you graduate up to getting a little bit more of some personal services into the mix. You might start getting some hardware a little bit more. You get the home hardwares, which are the ones that they'll try and bring in home improvement, but it's not just home improvement. They'll have housewares, they'll have sporting goods, and then you get a little bit larger, and you start to get the next mix of where you might get a smaller Canadian Tire store, or you may get a smaller an initial grocery, maybe an 8,000 to 15,000 square foot grocery. And then you can go from there where you start to hit those thresholds, maybe 25,000 in your trade area, where you can start to think about Walmarts. If there isn't anything, again, we have to understand where the existing stores are in that network as well. That's that sort of external pull factors. But then you can get to these. I always look at where the thresholds are of a community to understand what type of mix and at what point. Because some communities say, we need women's fashion, and I say, that's fine, but let's go through the list of who those women's fashion retailers are, and we'll say, and this is just that test. We'll say, okay, are you a big enough market to attract a retailer? No, not yet, but it doesn't mean you may have. There's still an opportunity for another local retailer to fill a gap, or if it's the Walmarts or Giant Tigers. I mean, there's often a desire for fashion in communities, surprisingly, but there's a certain threshold at which they work. And I've seen some communities where something like a Warehouse One is right on the bubble of being, having success. Their sales productivity might not be as high as they want in a bigger market, but they're just at a threshold where they can survive, and sort of getting towards little tipping points for these communities. So the idea of what is the best mix certainly comes down to where they are as a community on their trade area spectrum. And I imagine it's sort of a chart that I use in some of the reports, just simply as a bit of if everybody remembers The Price is Right, rest in peace, Bob Barker. If anybody remembers the yodeling, yodeling, and climb up the hill, it's sort of like that's your spectrum of growth for a community. And along that path, you have various thresholds, per capita, supportable space, and so forth. So that's how we view these things. And each one has a more robust mix that it can support. And then you get to points where you start to deal with communities that might support two of a store. So there's these interesting thresholds. And what I like to think is that through all of the various say 40, 50 studies we've done, we could, haven't done it yet because it's intuitive in ourselves, but we could probably compile an interesting list to show how that evolution continues over time.
And Kieron, how much of these thresholds that you just discussed come about as just having direct relationships with these retailers? Like how dialed in are you to some of these different retailers and just knowing these thresholds? Because those are probably not common knowledge to most developers or municipalities.
No, they're definitely not common knowledge. It just comes from the conversations that we have. Again, sometimes it's because of the no's that we get that we can check. I'm not going to say that every time we identify retailers in a community that we are 100% correct. I'm not naive in that way. So we'll have conversations with the retailer and say, you know, that's not a good fit for our community. So we understand that, but that also gives us the knowledge base to say, okay, well, if this market is X population and it's got this proximity, we think we feel it's good. The retailers themselves will have their own strategy, and it may be that they want to focus on more stores in an urban market and not worry about a new store in an untested market for them. So we learn those things through the conversations at the deal making events. And like I said, we can learn as much from a no as we can from the yeses.
Awesome. Thanks, Kieron. As always, it's an iterative process and it's a fun one. So at this point, as we get close to our half hour, I'd like to open the Q&A portion of the conversation. And we have a question in the DMs from Levi. Levi, would you like to ask a question directly?
Yeah, sure. Thanks. Thanks for the context, Kieron. Really helpful. Representing a retailer myself, I'm interested to hear a little bit about how car counts factor in, or traffic data factors into your analyses. Coming from the U.S., we use car counts quite often, and it's very helpful for me as a retailer. But I've kind of struggled to find that in Canada.
A good question, Levi. We do document traffic counts. And again, there is a correlation to some of the traffic counts as well. That might be, you know, whether it's less than 5,000 vehicles a day or 10 or 25,000. So we do try that. The problem in Canada is that the Ministry of Highways, the provincial authorities usually are decent with providing traffic counts, but once you get inside the city boundaries, it's often hit or miss, and especially the smaller communities don't track the data inside, and some of these some of the highway data, because it stops at the periphery of a town or might have a ring road around it, that's not really as useful. So sometimes when you're within the city boundaries, unless it's a bigger city like Saskatoon or Regina or Edmonton, you'll get data on the traffic counts within the small local arterials or internal major arterials, but it may not be. It's hit and miss. So what you're finding is probably the norm in Canada right now.
Understood. Thanks.
Thanks, Kieron. We have another question in the chat from Michael Stronger. Michael.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, so we've had a couple of potential deals here fall apart due to cost of distribution and construction costs. The most notable one was Costco pulling out on a fourth location here due to construction costs. And we recently were dealing with a pretty major retailer looking at our market, but we're relatively isolated here from a distribution perspective. And they just found that with the distribution requirements for their specific concept, it just wasn't affordable. They couldn't just open a retail store because they're too far from the hubs. So they would need to open a retail store with a huge warehousing component as well. And that ended up pushing the deal offside for now, at least, until maybe if we add another 500,000 people, get to Calgary size, we would have been able to secure this tenant for Winnipeg. We also had Amazon recently just close one of their 2 DCs here and merge into one. Meanwhile, Calgary, of course, is adding millions of feet. And so do you dig into those kind of things as well? Because what we're finding is the raw demographics justify a store, but then they're up against these other factors which are causing a lot of strain on the deal flow. And you can put in years of work in some instances for these things, only for them to fall apart at the last minute.
Yeah, that's a good point. We look at the distribution network or the supply chain, not in all examples. And I think if we're looking at bigger retailers, we will take that into account, where their nearest distribution outlet is, and how that factors in. But we also try to understand if it's a market they're looking to expand in. So if it's a small retailer where they want to bring in 4 or 5 stores, that might make it okay. But if it's one location of a larger destination, that can be a little challenging. I won't say that we go deep into detail on the logistics network. In industrial studies, we can look at that a bit more. But that crossover to retail is an interesting angle. I think the construction cost, we're all just trying to adjust to that. I mean, if Costco's cost is getting out of touch, I think for a relatively simple build, I'll say that just without, if it's tilt up, but it's not going to get much. They're pretty basic as it is for their construction costs. So there might be other factors they need to consider. Maybe it's their refrigeration costs or others. And I think the Winnipeg market's an interesting one because it's sort of, you're a big market, but you're not the major metropolitan. You're bigger than Saskatchewan and Regina, but elsewhere. And I've done specific studies with Altea Active, which is they opened a location there and sort of worked on some of the site selection for specific retailers. That's another sort of smaller task, looking at where they could locate locations. Again, but coming back to that distribution, that's not as much relevant for them. Their distribution supply chain is their customers. For others, if they're bringing in lots of product, then that can be a bigger factor. So I don't have an answer for where that's going to lie, but I do know that it's something we consider. It just depends again on the size of the market and the size of what the targets are they're chasing and what we think they can attract.
Thanks. I just think a lot what we're seeing is a lot of companies are diving into things based on sort of the simple demographic numbers, and then the brokers, of which I'm one, we can end up spending an incredible amount of time sourcing the real estate, only for them to later on in the they realize that Thompson, Manitoba is far away from Winnipeg, or they need to franchise Flin Flon, and you put in a lot of work and sourced the site and got it tied up, only for them to it basically, I'm suggesting that it's getting more complex to be in our business, and I think your services are more necessary than ever, because if it's going to be a no, we'd rather have the no early.
Yep.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, but there's nothing like turning a no into a yes too.
That can also happen if they have the right data. Exactly. Yeah.
Appreciate the question, Michael.
Great question, Michael. And with that, Kieron, I just wanted to say thank you for your time. It's great chatting with you today. Pleasure having you on, sharing your insights. And with that, I'll hand it back to Vicki for the conclusion.
On behalf of everyone at Consumer Real Estate Canada, we'd like to thank you, Kieron, for coming on the program today. And thank you so much for everyone to taking your time and joining us. Put your company name front and center. Don't forget to reach out to us at www.crec.live for your sponsorship opportunities. Mark your calendars now. The next CREC Live Cross Canada Call will be held on Tuesday, September 19th at 10 a.m. Mountain, 12 noon Eastern. Thank you, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your Tuesday.
Thanks, Vicki. Thanks, everyone. Appreciate the time.
Thank you.
Thanks, Kieron.
Thanks a lot.
Have a great day.
Bye.